In the manicured quiet of Carlisle, Ohio, perfection isn't a choice. It's a social contract. Brooke Skylar Richardson was the gold standard, a vibrant cheerleader with a porcelain smile. But in July 2017, a whisper in a doctor's office shattered the suburban silence, leading detectives to scorched earth behind a luxury home. Beneath the family's prize flowers lay the charred remains of a newborn, the byproduct of a 9-month lie that no one, not even her own parents, ever saw coming. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Carlisle, Ohio operates on a specific frequency, a low humming expectation of normalcy that filters through every tree-lined street and every freshly painted fence. It is a town where reputations are built over decades and can be dismantled in a single afternoon. In 2017, the Richardson name was synonymous with success. Scott and Kim were the pillars of their community, the kind of parents who never missed a game and whose children were always the first to volunteer. Their daughter, Brooke Skylar, known simply as Skylar to those close to her, was the crown jewel of this suburban crown. At 18, she was the quintessential Ohio girl, blonde, athletic, and possessed of a smile that seemed to suggest she had never known a day of true hardship. The social hierarchy of a place like Carlisle is often anchored by the high school football stadium, a cathedral of Friday night lights where the town's collective identity is forged in the dirt and the cheering. Skylar Richardson was a permanent fixture on those sidelines. To the casual observer, she was the definition of having it all. A varsity cheerleader, a member of the track team, and a student who navigated the complexities of senior year with a grace that bordered on the unnatural. But perfection is rarely a natural state. It is a performance that requires constant maintenance and a terrifying amount of discipline. Beneath the surface of the Golden Girl was a psyche frayed by years of body dysmorphia and an eating disorder that dictated the rhythm of her life. Her world was measured in calories, in the gap between her thighs, and in the approving nods from a mother who was equally obsessed with the family's aesthetic. Kim Richardson was more than just a parent. She was the architect of Skylar's public image. The two of them shared a bond that was intensely close, but also claustrophobic. A relationship built on the mutual understanding that their value was inextricably linked to how they were perceived by the neighbors. Kim's own social standing in Carlisle was high, and she expected nothing less from her daughter. The pressure wasn't always vocal. It was in the way a second helping of dinner was silently judged, or the way a slightly tighter-fitting track uniform would elicit a subtle, worried glance. In the months leading up to the spring of 2017, Skylar's struggle with food had taken a new, more frantic turn. She had always been small, dangerously so at times, but her obsession with fitness had become a shield. She was known for her orthorexia, a pathological obsession with healthful eating. In her mind, being thin was synonymous with being good, being worthy, and most importantly, being safe. If she was always at the gym, if she was always talking about her clean diet, no one would look too closely at the changes in her body. The irony was thick. In a house where every meal was scrutinized and every pound was a talking point, the most significant physical transformation of Skylar's life was about to go completely unnoticed. Or perhaps, more accurately, it was something everyone, from her parents to her coaches, unconsciously chose not to see because it didn't fit the established narrative. Carlisle is the kind of town that rewards those who stay within the lines. The Richardsons lived in a sprawling, beautiful home on Eagle Ridge Drive, a place where the interior design was as curated as their social calendar. They were the perfect family, a label they wore like armor. But armor is heavy, and by the time Skylar entered the final months of her senior year, the weight of that perfection was beginning to crush her. She was 18, a girl standing on the precipice of adulthood, heading toward a prestigious future at Miami University. The social echo of the town was loud, a constant reminder that any deviation from the script would be noticed and dissected. As the humidity of the Ohio summer began to settle over the valley, the air in the Richardson house grew thick with an unspoken, vibrating tension. Skylar was becoming more withdrawn, her smiles more forced, her movements more deliberate. She was a girl who had been trained from birth to manage her image, to hide her flaws, and to present a flawless facade to the world. But the facade was cracking. Her track teammates noticed she was slower. Her fellow cheerleaders noticed she was shorter of breath. But in a community built on the polite ignoring of unpleasantness, no one asked the questions that needed to be asked. The stage was set for a tragedy that would force an entire town to look into the mirror and wonder, what else were they choosing not to see in their pursuit of the suburban ideal? This wasn't just about a girl and a secret. It was about the crushing, invisible weight of being exactly who everyone expected you to be, every single second of the day. The Golden Girl was becoming a stranger in her own home, a ghost moving through the hallways of a life she no longer recognized. In the quiet rooms of the Eagle Ridge house, the silence was louder than any scream. It was a silence that would eventually be broken by the sound of a shovel hitting the dirt in the middle of the night. The secret didn't begin with a whisper. It began with the clinical, rhythmic thumping of a heartbeat in a small, sterile examination room on April 26, 2017. Skylar had walked into the gynecologist's office, seeking a prescription for birth control pills, a pragmatic step for a girl planning her future at university. Instead, she was met with the cold, immovable reality of an ultrasound. Dr. William Andrew delivered the news with the gravity of a seasoned professional, informing the 18-year-old that she wasn't just pregnant, she was nearly 32 weeks along. The finish line was already in sight, and the Golden Girl of Carlisle was running out of track. Her reaction was a masterclass in the very dissociation that had defined her adolescence. There were no tears, no frantic phone calls to her mother, and certainly no reaching out to the father, a boy named Trey Johnson, with whom she had shared a brief, unremarkable summer fling. Instead, Skylar simply looked at the doctor and stated that she could not have this baby. It wasn't a question or an opening for a dialogue. It was a desperate attempt to delete a reality that threatened the architecture of her life. When she walked out of that clinic, she didn't just leave a medical record behind, she left the truth. The weeks that followed were a grueling marathon of deception. In the Richardson household, where every physical change was a topic of conversation, Skylar managed to perform a miraculous act of camouflage. She leaned into the narrative she had built for years, the girl who was obsessed with the gym, the girl who struggled with bloating due to her eating disorder, the girl who lived on a diet of clean proteins and green tea. She traded her form-fitting cheerleading outfits for oversized hoodies and baggy tracksuits, claiming she was bulking for her fitness goals. It was a lie that her family, perhaps blinded by their own need for her to be perfect, swallowed without question. The psychological weight of this silence was astronomical. A crushing, invisible atmosphere that she breathed in every morning when she checked her reflection in the mirror. She watched as her stomach hardened, as the movements of the life inside her became impossible to ignore. Yet, she continued to post photos on social media of her flat midriff, using angles and filters to maintain the illusion. She was a girl living in two parallel universes, one where she was the graduating senior preparing for prom, and another where a ticking clock was counting down to a moment she refused to name. May 5th, 2017, just 2 days before the end, marked the ultimate test of her facade. It was the night of the senior prom. Skylar stood before her mother in a tight, shimmering dress, a garment that should have announced her condition to the world. But she had become an expert in the art of the internalized pregnancy. She held her breath, she stood with a specific posture, and she let the high-stress environment of the perfect family event mask the physical toll of her 38-week term. She danced, she smiled for the cameras, and she posed with her current boyfriend, Brandon, a boy who looked the part of the handsome accessory, but had no inkling that he was standing next to a girl on the verge of a medical crisis. Even as the town of Carlisle celebrated its youth, Skylar was retreating further into a mental bunker. She told the investigators later that she had convinced herself the baby wasn't real, that it was just another symptom of her broken body. This wasn't just a secret, it was a total psychological fracture. She had no nursery, no baby clothes, and no plan. She didn't search for how to give birth on her phone. Instead, she searched for how to get a flat stomach fast. The denial was so profound that it bordered on the pathological. She was waiting for the problem to go away, even as the biological inevitability of labor began to shadow her every move. The social echo of her life, the texts from friends, the congratulations on her college acceptance, felt like they were coming from a distant planet. She moved through the hallways of Carlisle High School like a ghost, her secret tucked away beneath layers of cotton and a practiced, empty smile. Every time her mother complimented her on her weight loss or her dedication to the gym, it was like a fresh twist of a knife. The very traits that made her the perfect girl, her discipline, her ability to hide her pain, her obsession with appearance, were the very traits that were now fueling her descent into a nightmare. The silence wasn't just hers. It was a collective failure of a family and a community that prized the image over the individual. It was the silence of a mother who didn't notice the physical changes in a daughter she saw every day. It was the silence of a father who was too proud of his daughter's athletic prowess to see her suffering. And it was the silence of a girl who believed that being bad was a fate worse than death. As the first week of May drew to a close, the Ohio spring was in full bloom. But for Skylar Richardson, the world was about to turn cold, dark, and unimaginably quiet. She was an 18-year-old girl standing on the edge of a cliff, and the only thing she knew for certain was that she couldn't let anyone see her fall. The countdown was over. The 9-month silence was about to be broken by the only sound she had spent her entire life trying to suppress. The sound of a reality she couldn't control. The night of May 7th, 2017 didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a heavy, suffocating pause in the middle of a sentence. While the rest of Carlisle slept under a mild spring sky, the temperature hovering in the low 60s Fahrenheit, the second floor of the Richardson home on Eagle Ridge Drive became the stage for a silent, clinical horror. Brooke Skylar Richardson was no longer a cheerleader or a student. She was a body in revolt. The 9 months of denial had reached their biological conclusion, and there was no longer any hoodie large enough to hide the truth. She retreated to the master bathroom, a space defined by white tile, expensive soaps, and a level of cleanliness that mirrored the family's public reputation. As the first sharp, localized waves of labor began to tear through her, Skylar didn't cry out. She couldn't. To scream would be to invite her parents, sleeping just rooms away, into a reality that would destroy everything they had built. She leaned against the cold porcelain of the bathtub, her fingers gripping the edge until her knuckles turned the color of the tiles. The sensory anchors of that night were stark. The hum of the air conditioning, the smell of lavender-scented candles, and the rhythmic, terrifying pressure radiating from her spine. In the darkness, the Golden Girl was performing her most grueling routine yet, a solitary birth. She told the investigators later that the pain was like nothing she had ever imagined, a physical dismantling that left her gasping for air in the humid bathroom. Every contraction was a countdown. She moved between the toilet and the floor, her movements frantic yet hushed, terrified that a single misplaced groan would bring her mother to the door. This wasn't a miracle of life. It was a desperate, messy, and silent extraction of a secret that had grown too large to contain. Somewhere in the early morning hours, the baby arrived, a girl. Skylar would later call her Annabelle, but in that moment, the child was an enigma. According to the story Skylar would eventually tell, the infant was purple, cold, and, most importantly, silent. There was no first cry to pierce the suburban quiet, no movement to signal a future. Whether this was the truth of a tragic stillbirth or a convenient narrative for a girl in a corner would become the central, bloody question of the next 2 years. But that night, in the dim light of the bathroom, the only thing that mattered was the weight of the tiny, limp body in her hands. The panic that followed was a cold, vibrating frequency. Skylar sat on the floor, the evidence of her crime stark against the white tile. She didn't call 911. She didn't wake her father. Instead, she began the process of erasing. She used towels to scrub the floor until it gleamed, a frantic effort to return the room to its state of pristine perfection. Then, she wrapped the infant in a towel and prepared for the final act. The walk from the back door to the edge of the property felt like a journey across a desert. The backyard was a sprawling manicured expanse, featuring a patio and a fire pit. the quintessential settings for the Richardson family's summer gatherings. But Skylar wasn't looking for a place to host a party. She moved toward the darkness beneath the trees, the damp Ohio soil clinging to her bare feet. She found a spot between two large trees, far enough from the house to be hidden, but close enough to be under the constant, silent watch of her bedroom window. Digging a grave with your bare hands and a small garden spade in the middle of the night is a sensory experience that leaves a permanent mark on the psyche. The smell of wet earth and decaying leaves, the sound of the metal blade hitting rocks and roots, the frantic, shallow breaths of an 18-year-old girl who believed her life was over. She dug until the hole was perhaps a foot deep. It wasn't a grave for a person, it was a hole for a secret. She placed the towel-wrapped bundle inside and covered it with the cold, dark dirt, tamping it down until the ground looked undisturbed. When she returned to the house, the silence was still there, but it was different now. It was the silence of a tomb. She climbed back into her bed, her body aching and her mind fractured. She checked her phone. It was nearly sunrise. She did what she had always done when things got difficult. She tried to pivot back to the golden girl persona. She texted her mother about her plans for the day. She posted a selfie about her workout routine, and she began the process of pretending that the night in the dark had never happened. But the backyard wasn't empty. Beneath the roots of the trees, the physical evidence of her 9-month lie was cooling in the Ohio earth. The contrast was almost too much to bear. Inside, a girl was washing the blood from her skin and preparing for a graduation ceremony. Outside, a shallow, unmarked grave was waiting to be found. The morning light of May 8th hit the Richardson house with a chilling normalcy. Scott and Kim woke up. The coffee was brewed, and the routine of perfection continued. Skylar moved through the next few days like a sleepwalker. She attended her graduation, she smiled for family photos, and she even went to the gym. To the neighbors, she was the same Skylar Richardson they had always known, perhaps a bit thinner, perhaps a bit more tired, but still the pride of Carlisle. They had no idea that every time she looked out of her window, her eyes were drawn to the patch of dirt between the trees. Every time the wind blew through the leaves, she heard the rustle of the secret she had buried. This night would become the focal point of a forensic war. The prosecution would later argue that she didn't just bury the baby. They would claim she tried to burn it, using the family fire pit to incinerate the evidence of her shame. They would point to charred bones and a girl who was too obsessed with her image to allow a child to live. The defense would counter with a story of a terrified teenager who gave birth to a stillborn baby and didn't know what else to do. But on the night of May 7th, there were no lawyers and no forensic experts. There was only a girl, a spade, and a dark, quiet backyard in a town that never wanted to know the truth. The night in the dark was the moment the perfect girl died, even if it took 2 more months for the world to notice. The secret wasn't just in the ground, it was in the way she walked, the way she didn't eat, and the way she stared at the tree line until her eyes burned. The architecture of perfection had held, but the foundation was made of dirt and bone, and the first cracks were already beginning to show. The heat of July in Ohio is a heavy, stagnant thing, a thick blanket of humidity that clings to the skin and slows the world to a crawl. On July 12, 2017, 2 months after the night in the dark, Brooke Skylar Richardson returned to the gynecologist's office. She wasn't there for a checkup or to discuss the life she had carried. She was there for a refill of her birth control pills. She walked into the clinic with the same composed porcelain doll exterior that had shielded her for months. But the medical staff had not forgotten the April ultrasound. Dr. William Andrew and his colleague, Dr. Casey, were met with a girl who looked significantly different. The physical weight of the pregnancy was gone, yet there was no mention of a child. When the doctors gently questioned her about the baby, the architecture of perfection finally suffered its first catastrophic collapse. The silence that had lasted 9 months dissolved into a few jagged, terrifying sentences. Skylar admitted that she had given birth alone in the middle of the night, that the baby was stillborn, and, most chillingly, that she had buried the remains in the backyard of her parents' home. She spoke of the event with a flat, detached affect, as if she were describing a bad dream rather than a forensic reality. The doctors, bound by law and a sudden, visceral sense of alarm, contacted the Warren County Sheriff's Office. The secret was no longer in the ground, it was on the record. The investigation didn't begin with sirens and flashing lights. It began with a phone call to Lieutenant John Fain. Fain was a man used to the darker corners of human behavior, but the report coming out of Carlisle felt uniquely unsettling. He met Skylar at the police station later that day. The atmosphere of that first interview was a study in psychological tension. Skylar sat in the sterile room, her small frame dwarfed by the chair, still performing the role of the good girl. She told the lieutenant that the baby was born on May 7th, that it didn't breathe, and that she had acted out of a blind, paralyzing fear of her parents' reaction. She described the burial spot with an unnerving precision, pointing to the area between the two large trees near the fire pit. By the evening of July 14th, the Richardsons' perfect property on Eagle Ridge Drive was transformed into a theater of forensic archaeology. The sensory contrast was jarring: the vibrant green of the midsummer lawn, the colorful flower beds maintained by Kim Richardson, and the bright yellow crime scene tape that now bisected the yard. Neighbors watched from behind their curtains as men in white Tyvek suits moved through the heat, carrying shovels, sifting screens, and small hand tools. The social echo of the town began to vibrate with a new, ugly energy. The rumors traveled faster than the detectives could dig. Whispers of a hidden pregnancy, of a girl who had taken care of a problem to save her reputation. The excavation was a slow, agonizing process. Forensic teams from the coroner's office and anthropological experts treated the backyard like a historical site, aware that every inch of soil could hold a piece of the puzzle. The air was filled with the rhythmic sound of metal hitting dirt, a dull, repetitive thud that echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Lieutenant Fain watched as the specialists knelt in the dirt, their movements deliberate and respectful. They weren't just looking for remains. They were looking for the truth of how that life had ended. At approximately 10:30 p.m., beneath the glare of portable floodlights that cast long, distorted shadows against the Richardson home, the first discovery was made. About 12 inches beneath the surface, in the very spot Skylar had described, the team uncovered the first small, fragile bones. The sight of a tiny human skull emerging from the dark Ohio soil was a moment that silenced everyone on the scene. It was a physical manifestation of a tragedy that had been denied for months. The remains were meticulously removed, placed into evidence containers, and transported to the Montgomery County Coroner's Office for a more detailed examination. As the forensic team worked, the Richardsons, Scott and Kim, stood in a state of apparent frozen shock. The Golden Girl was inside with investigators, while her parents watched their backyard being dismantled. The realization that their daughter had carried a child to term, delivered it in their home, and buried it just feet from their back door while they slept, was a psychological blow that seemed to defy their understanding of reality. The image they had curated so carefully was not just cracked, it was being dug up and placed in evidence bags. The initial field report from the scene contained a detail that would change the trajectory of the case from a medical tragedy to a potential capital crime. One of the forensic experts noted that some of the bones appeared charred or blackened. This single observation, made in the flickering light of the backyard, suggested something far more sinister than a panicked burial. It suggested an attempt to incinerate the remains. It suggested malice. It suggested that Brooke Skylar Richardson hadn't just buried her secret, she had tried to destroy it with fire. That night, as the floodlights were finally packed away and the Eagle Ridge house returned to darkness, the town of Carlisle was no longer the same. The backyard secret was the only topic of conversation in the local diners and on social media. The girl on the sidelines, the one who had represented the very best of the community, was now being cast as a monster in the town's collective imagination. The July excavation had provided the remains, but it had also unearthed a well of public anger and suspicion that would only grow as the forensic war began. The perfect girl was gone, replaced by a defendant in a case that would force the world to look at the dark side of the suburban dream. The walls of an interrogation room have a way of absorbing the truth while radiating a specific kind of sterile, high-stakes pressure. Inside the Warren County Sheriff's Office, the air was conditioned to a crisp, uncomfortable chill, a stark contrast to the sweltering July heat outside. Brooke Skylar Richardson sat across from Lieutenant John Fain and Detective Brandy Carter, her small frame pulled tight, her eyes darting between the investigators. She was still trying to be the good girl, the polite student who followed instructions. But the detectives were no longer looking for a missing person. They were looking for a killer. The first interrogation was an exercise in careful navigation. Skylar spoke in a small, hollow voice, recounting the night in May with a detached precision that bordered on the clinical. She told them she was terrified, that she didn't know what to do, and that the baby had been born into a cold, silent world. She maintained that she never heard a cry, never felt a movement. It was a story of a medical tragedy handled by a teenager in shock. But the detectives were trained to look for the fissures in such narratives, and they were already armed with a preliminary forensic report that would change the temperature of the room. The forensic war began with a single, devastating error that would become the epicenter of the entire case. Dr. Elizabeth Murray, a respected forensic anthropologist, had performed an initial examination of the tiny remains found in the shallow grave. In the flickering light of her laboratory, she noted a dark, scorched appearance on several of the bones. She concluded and communicated to the investigators that the remains had been charred or burned. It was a bombshell that obliterated any chance of a sympathetic hearing for Skylar. In the eyes of the law, a burial was a panic. A burning was a desecration. It was the difference between a girl who was scared and a monster who was calculating. Equipped with this fact, the investigators brought Skylar back into the room for a second, much more aggressive interview on July 20th, 2017. The tone had shifted from inquiry to accusation. They told her they knew the truth. They told her the bones were burned. They pushed her hour after hour, using the psychological leverage of her own good girl persona against her. They suggested that perhaps she had tried to cremate the baby to get rid of the evidence. They pressured her to admit that the baby might have been alive, even for a moment. In a phenomenon often seen in high-pressure interrogations of young, vulnerable suspects, Skylar began to fold. Her need to please authority, her desire to fix the situation, led her into a psychological trap. When the detectives insisted the baby was burned, she eventually stopped fighting the narrative. She told them she might have used a lighter, that she might have seen a small flame. She even reached a point where she admitted the baby might have made a sound. These weren't statements of fact. They were concessions made by a girl whose mind had been dismantled by hours of guilt-tripping and leading questions. To the prosecution, it was a confession. To the defense, it was a tragedy of coercion. The leak of the burned baby narrative to the public was like pouring gasoline on a forest fire. The social echo of Carlisle and the surrounding Warren County turned toxic almost overnight. The headlines were sensational, painting a picture of a cheerleader who gave birth, killed her baby, and then tried to incinerate the remains in the family fire pit. The perfect girl was now the most hated person in Ohio. The community's reaction was visceral. People left dolls on the Richardsons' lawn, protesters gathered outside the courthouse, and the online discourse was a sewer of vitriol. The forensic error had poisoned the well of public opinion before a single juror was ever seated. As the case moved toward trial, a secondary forensic battle was brewing behind the scenes. The defense team, led by high-profile attorneys Charlie and Ritt Ritgers, had hired their own experts to review the remains. They brought in world-renowned specialists who looked at the bones and saw something entirely different. They realized that the charred appearance wasn't the result of fire at all. It was soil staining. The dark, organic material of the shallow grave had seeped into the fragile, porous bones over the 2 months they were buried, creating a discoloration that an eager eye could mistake for burning. When Dr. Murray eventually re-examined the remains and realized her initial assessment was wrong, she attempted to correct the record. She admitted that the bones were not burned, but by then, the burned baby narrative was a runaway train. The prosecution, having built their entire case around the idea of a mother trying to cremate her child, refused to let go of the momentum. They shifted their focus, but the psychological damage was done. The jury would eventually be told the bones weren't burned, but they had already seen the headlines, heard the confession, and formed a mental image of a girl with a lighter in a dark backyard. The forensic war wasn't just about bones and soil. It was a war over the soul of the defendant. It was a battle between a biological reality, the possibility of a stillbirth, and a social narrative of a golden girl who would do anything to keep her crown. The interrogations highlighted the terrifying power of the state to shape a teenager's memory, and the forensic error showed how easily science can be blinded by a desire for a definitive answer. Behind the sterile walls of the interrogation room, the truth hadn't just been buried, it had been distorted beyond recognition, leaving a fractured girl to face a jury that had already heard the worst possible version of her story. The sensory details of those hours in the station were etched into Skylar's memory. The smell of burnt coffee, the clicking of the detective's pens, and the heavy, accusing silence that followed every one of her denials. She was a girl who had never even had a speeding ticket, now facing the possibility of life in prison because of a confession that felt more like a surrender. The detectives had played on her biggest fear, that her parents would hate her, telling her that the only way to save her family was to tell them what they wanted to hear. It was a masterclass in psychological pressure, one that would leave a permanent scar on the case and ensure that, no matter the verdict, Skylar Richardson would never again be the perfect girl of Carlisle. The burned bone controversy became a cautionary tale for forensic science, a reminder of the catastrophic consequences of an initial, unverified field observation. But in 2017, it was the weapon the prosecution used to ensure Skylar wouldn't just be tried for a crime. She would be tried for being a monster. The momentum of the case was now unstoppable, fueled by a mixture of forensic error, a coerced confession, and a town's demand for justice for the tiny life buried beneath the trees. The courtroom in September 2019 was a pressure cooker of suburban judgment. 2 years after the July excavation, the Golden Girl stood before a jury, her porcelain facade replaced by the hollowed-out stare of a woman facing life in prison. The prosecution painted a portrait of a calculated killer, a girl who sacrificed her child on the altar of her own reputation. They focused on her 9-month lie and the clinical silence of the bathroom birth. The defense countered with a narrative of a medical tragedy, a stillborn girl named Annabelle, and a teenager dismantled by an eating disorder and the crushing expectation of perfection. When the verdict finally echoed through the hall, it was a split decision that satisfied no one. Skylar was acquitted of murder, manslaughter, and child endangerment, but found guilty of the gross abuse of a corpse. The judge sentenced her to 3 years of probation, a punishment that felt like a slap in the face to those who demanded blood, and a lifelong mark for the girl who just wanted to be perfect. The social echo of Carlisle has faded, but the silence on Eagle Ridge Drive remains heavy. Brooke Skylar Richardson remains a polarizing figure, a girl caught between a biological crisis and a suburban dream that left no room for error. Today, the patch of earth between the two trees is covered in thick grass, a quiet, unmarked end for the child she called Annabelle. It stands as a grim anchor for a town that learned, too late, that the most dangerous secrets aren't the ones we bury, but the ones we refuse to see. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.